Most empaths do not leave when they are hurt. They leave when they finally realize the pain was never an accident. That is the part nobody wants to admit, because an empath can survive disrespect. They can survive neglect. They can survive being ignored, misunderstood, even emotionally abandoned. But the moment they recognize intention behind the wound, something inside them dies quietly. And once that part dies, they never come back the same. Most people think empaths are weak because they stay too long. But staying is not weakness. Staying is hope fighting against reality. Staying is the mind trying to protect the illusion that love can still heal what betrayal already poisoned. And this is where it gets dangerous, because empaths do not leave at the first red flag. They study it, excuse it, shrink themselves around it. They tell themselves you are wounded, misunderstood, broken. They turn your cruelty into a tragedy so they can keep loving you without hating themselves for it. That is the unconscious pattern nobody sees. An empath does not just love people. They absorb them. They internalize pain that never belonged to them. And slowly, they confuse emotional suffering with emotional connection. Most people don't see this. The empath is not addicted to toxicity. They are addicted to potential, to the fantasy of who you could become if you finally healed. And that fantasy becomes more real to them than the damage happening in front of their eyes. So they stay even while their nervous system is collapsing in silence. Even while they lose sleep, replaying conversations that destroyed them. Even while their body starts reacting to emotional pain, their mouth refuses to speak about, because deep down the empath believes love means endurance. That if they just understand you enough, you will stop hurting them. But here's the truth. Some people do not want understanding. They want access to your patience, your forgiveness, your emotional labor, your softness. And the empath keeps giving because they think empathy creates safety. But empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. That is why the final breaking point always shocks people, because the empath never announces it. There is no dramatic speech, no revenge, no warning, just silence. Cold, terrifying silence. And suddenly the person who tolerated everything disappears, like they were never emotionally attached at all. But what nobody understands is this. The empath left long before their body physically walked away. They left the moment they realized their pain no longer mattered to you. That was the line, not the disrespect itself, the indifference to it. Because empaths can forgive mistakes, but they cannot survive repeated emotional betrayal disguised as misunderstanding. And this is where most people destroy them without noticing. They confuse forgiveness with permission. Every time the empath stays, people think the damage was not serious. Every time the empath understands the empath. People think the wound was small, but internally something terrifying is happening. The empath is collecting evidence, not consciously, subconsciously. Every dismissal, every manipulation, every moment their emotions were minimized, stored quietly inside the nervous system like emotional fingerprints, until one day the body refuses to participate anymore. That is why empaths suddenly become numb. It is not revenge. It is psychological exhaustion. The soul shutting down after carrying pain too long without protection. And when that shutdown happens, the empath becomes someone unrecognizable, detached, unreadable, emotionally unreachable. Not because they stopped caring, because caring started destroying them. Most people only value the empath after the disconnect happens, because that is when they finally feel the absence of unconditional energy. Suddenly the room feels colder, conversations feel empty, validation disappears. The emotional safety they took for granted vanishes, and now they panic. Now they chase. Now they promise change. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The empath is not moved by apologies anymore once emotional trust dies, because trust is not destroyed by one betrayal. It is destroyed by patterns, repeated patterns, predictable wounds, the same knife wearing a different mask every week. And eventually the empath stops listening to words completely. They start listening to emotional consistency, energy, tone, intent, because trauma teaches people to hear what language hides. That is why empaths become terrifying once they awaken psychologically. They stop explaining themselves, stop begging, stop overgiving. And the people who benefited from their emotional tolerance suddenly call them cold, changed, selfish. But the truth is darker than that. The empath did not become cold, they became conscious. Conscious of how much pain they normalized just to avoid abandonment. And this realization destroys them internally, because now they must confront the deepest wound of all. The fear that they were never truly loved, only emotionally consumed. That realization breaks something ancient inside a person. Because empaths secretly believe if they love deeply enough, people will eventually choose them gently. But life teaches a brutal lesson. Some people only love what they can control, and empaths are easy to control when guilt becomes the leash. So the empath keeps overextending themselves, keeps abandoning their own needs to keep peace alive, keeps becoming emotionally available for people who disappear the moment accountability enters the room. And this is where it gets dangerous, because eventually the empath stops recognizing themselves. They become exhausted from performing emotional CPR on relationships already spiritually dead. They smile while resentment quietly poisons them from the inside. Mindy. They say I'm okay while their subconscious screams for escape. And one day, the split happens. The mask falls. The illusion collapses. The empath finally sees the relationship clearly without emotional fantasy protecting it. And once they see it clearly, they can never unsee it again. That is the moment people mistake for sudden abandonment, but it was never sudden. It was delayed grief. The empath mourned the relationship while still inside it. That is why when they finally leave, they look calm. The breakdown already happened in private, alone at 3 a.m. In silence nobody witnessed. Most people never see the hidden war inside an empath. The constant battle between intuition and attachment. One part of them knows they are being emotionally drained. The other part keeps remembering who you were in the beginning. And that contradiction traps them for years because empaths fall in love with emotional memory, not present reality. They keep chasing the version of you that only appeared long enough to create dependency. And this is where manipulation becomes invisible, because the empath is not controlled through fear. They are controlled through hope. Hope that your inconsistency is temporary. Hope that your distance is stress. Hope that your cruelty is confusion. Hope becomes the prison. But here's the truth. When someone repeatedly hurts you after understanding your pain, it is no longer unconscious behavior. It becomes choice. And empaths suffer deeply because they struggle to accept that some people choose emotional selfishness knowingly. They keep searching for hidden innocence in people who already revealed their character clearly. Atheism me because accepting the truth means grieving the fantasy, and grieving the fantasy feels like grieving part of themselves. Most people don't understand how dangerous emotional repression becomes inside an empath. They swallow anger until sadness replaces identity. They silence instincts until anxiety becomes normal. They tolerate disrespect until self-worth starts depending on survival. And eventually they no longer know whether they are staying out of love or fear of being alone. That is the hidden psychological collapse nobody talks about. The empath slowly disappears while trying to save everyone else emotionally. And the tragedy is many people reward this self-erasure. They praise the empath for being patient while benefiting from their lack of boundaries. They admire the empathy while exploiting the forgiveness. They say you're different while contributing to the damage, making them disappear. And this where it gets terrifying, because the empath eventually reaches emotional saturation, a point where the nervous system cannot absorb another betrayal without transforming completely. That transformation is not loud. It is silent, almost spiritual. The empath stops chasing closure, stops needing validation, stops trying to convince people to care, because they finally understand something devastating. You cannot heal inside the environment that taught you to abandon yourself. That realization changes everything. Suddenly they stop arguing during disrespect, stop defending their feelings, stop explaining why certain behavior hurts them, because repeating your pain to someone committed to misunderstanding you becomes humiliation. And once the empath feels that humiliation deeply enough, detachment begins. Real detachment, not temporary distance. A complete emotional severing. The kind that scares people because it feels irreversible. And it usually is. Because when an empath truly leaves, they do not just leave physically. They remove emotional access. The warmth disappears. The emotional transparency disappears. The softness disappears. And the people who once ignored their value suddenly feel psychologically starved. Not because the empath was perfect, but because genuine emotional presence is rare. Most people realize too late that the empath was carrying the emotional depth of the entire relationship alone. That is why the silence after they leave feels unbearable. It forces people to meet themselves without emotional cushioning, without someone translating their chaos into understanding, without someone constantly absorbing tension to keep the connection alive. And suddenly the person who seemed too sensitive becomes impossible to replace. But here's the deepest truth of all. The empath's final goodbye is rarely about anger. It is about self-preservation, a subconscious decision to stop bleeding for people who keep calling the wound love. And once that instinct awakens, the empath becomes unreachable. Because now they understand the difference between being needed and being valued. Needed people are used, valued people are protected. That distinction changes the empath forever. Now they watch actions more than words, patterns more than promises, consistency more than intensity. Because they learned the hard way that emotional intensity can exist without genuine care. In fact, the most destructive relationships are often the most emotionally intense. Chaos creates attachment. Confusion creates obsession. Intermittent affection creates addiction. And empaths confuse that addiction with destiny until the damage becomes undeniable. Most people never realize how much emotional pain an empath hides behind calm behavior, because empaths are masters at making suffering look graceful. They laugh while emotionally drowning, comfort others while internally collapsing, stay gentle while silently breaking apart. But eventually the subconscious rebels. The body rebels. The soul rebels. And the empath finally asks the question they avoided their entire life. What if the person destroying me is the person I keep trying to save? That question changes everything because now the empath stops romanticizing pain, stops glorifying sacrifice, stops believing unconditional love means unconditional access. And this is where the rebirth begins. Painful, lonely, brutal, but real. Because the empath finally understands the lesson betrayal was trying to teach them all along. Not everyone deserves unlimited versions of your forgiveness.